The battlefield was silent now, but only because most of the ships were already wrecked and burning in the cold void. The stars shone faintly behind clouds of drifting metal, twisted hulls, and frozen bodies. Somewhere among the scattered corpses of fleets, a small human cargo ship drifted with engines low and lights dimmed. To anyone scanning, it was only another merchant vessel that had wandered too close to the fighting. No one looked twice at it. No one expected anything from a trader when great war fleets were at work. Inside the cargo bay, Callan sat in his worn pilot chair, watching the debris on his old screen. His ship was not built for war. It had dents, patches, and parts collected from half a dozen worlds. The weapons on it were little more than antique lasers for chasing pirates, yet Callan was calm. He did not look like a man trapped in the middle of a war zone. His hands were steady as he tapped on the console and marked the positions of the wrecks. His eyes were sharp, calculating, more alive than most soldiers' eyes had ever been. He was not a soldier, not a commander, just a merchant who had carried cargo through many star systems. He traded in tools, machine parts, power cells, food packs, and anything else that kept life running on the edges of space. The soldiers of great empires never cared for men like him. To them, traders were invisible, unimportant. But Callan knew something the soldiers never noticed. He had watched them for years. He had seen how their ships consumed endless supplies, how fleets lived and died by what they ate, drank, and burned for power. He understood that wars were not only fought with weapons, but with what kept those weapons alive. It was knowledge. He never spoke aloud. Now in the silence after battle, it seemed that knowledge might be more dangerous than any gun. Callan leaned back and thought of the last checkpoint he had passed before the fighting started. 2 patrol ships had scanned him quickly and waved him on. Had not cared about the crates stacked in his hold. Why would they? It was the usual cargo: purifiers, spare circuits, food bricks, sealed in dull gray packages. Nothing special, nothing worth a second glance. But Callan smiled faintly because he knew something was hidden there. Something no patrol ship could see unless they looked very closely. And soldiers never looked closely at merchants. Their pride blinded them. They looked for weapons, not tricks. They looked for danger in barrels of plasma and racks of torpedoes, not in small boxes of trade goods. That was why Callan was still alive when warships far larger than his had been torn apart. He checked his scanners again. Wreckage floated across the grid, but signals of surviving fleets were still there in the distance. 2 massive empires had been fighting for months in this sector, each side desperate to control a narrow trade route that linked richer systems. They had destroyed cities, burned colonies, and filled space with corpses, all for the right to control the supply lanes. Callan had passed through it all, silent and unnoticed. At first, he had only wanted to survive and make money. But with every passing battle, with every broken fleet and burned planet, an idea had grown inside his head. It was dangerous, mad even, but it was clever. It was the kind of idea only a trader would think of, someone who understood the value of small things. As his ship drifted closer to a ruined cruiser, Callan thought back to the words of an old merchant he once met on a dusty station far from here. The man had told him a warship dies, not when its hull breaks, but when its stomach empties. Callan had never forgotten that. Soldiers think of pride, commanders think of victory, but merchants think of hunger, water, and fuel. That was the truth of space. Staring at the wrecks, Callan whispered those words again, and he felt the weight of the trick he had hidden in his cargo. He wondered how long before someone noticed, wondered if they ever would. For now, no one suspected him. The fleets in the distance were regrouping, and soon they would fight again. Already requests were going out for supplies. The armies were hungry, tired, desperate for food and power to keep going. Callan knew they would call for him, or for someone like him. They always did. And when they did, he would answer with a smile and a fair price. He would trade with both sides as he always had, pretending to be neutral, pretending to care only for profit. That was the mask he wore, and it had kept him alive in a galaxy that ate the weak out. But behind that mask, his mind was sharp and waiting. He was ready to play a game the soldiers would never see until it was too late. The ship shook gently as it passed through drifting metal, and Callan adjusted the thrusters. His face was calm, but his eyes gleamed. He knew that history was not always written by admirals. Sometimes it was written by those who understood how to move unseen, how to play both sides, how to hide a knife in plain sight. He had no army, no fleet, no powerful weapons, yet he had a secret, and in the dark silence of space, a secret was often sharper than any blade. He let the ship drift, waiting for the next call, the next chance to trade, the next step in a plan no one but him understood. The next day, Callan's ship floated quietly into a neutral station, a place where soldiers from both sides came to refuel and resupply. The war was endless in this sector, and yet even endless war needed places like this where trade flowed. The station smelled of metal, fuel, and fear. Guards in different uniforms walked the halls, glaring at each other, but no one fired. Not here. Even enemies needed food and power, and they tolerated each other's presence as long as the merchants kept their ships full. Callan docked his small vessel, stepping out into the bright lights of the bay. The captains ignored him. Some laughed quietly at the patched hull of his ship, thinking it belonged to a desperate trader who would sell for scraps. That was fine with him. He liked being ignored. He walked calmly to the registry and signed his name in the log like any other man doing honest work. Yet his mind was sharp, always watching, always measuring. Inside his cargo hold were rows of crates stacked neatly, sealed with the usual dull markings of trade goods. Food bricks, clean water containers, repair circuits, purifiers, power packs. Nothing strange, nothing threatening. Any inspector opening them would see the same boring items. But Callan had spent months preparing. Each crate had a hidden design, a place where something extra rested. It was not a weapon in the traditional sense. Not a bomb, not a gun, nothing so obvious. What he carried were small devices of his own making, built in secret from scraps and parts bought across systems. They were power disruptors, tiny machines that could weaken engines, spoil energy cells, and scramble circuits without anyone knowing. The source. They were hidden so carefully that even when he opened a crate himself, he had to touch the right spot to find the mechanism. No soldier ever bothered. They only saw what they expected to see. That was his shield, the invisibility of a tradesman's goods. As he stood by his cargo hold, 2 alien officers walked up. Their armor gleamed with the red colors of the Valen Empire. One looked at him with sharp reptilian eyes, the other with a heavy tusked jaw. They demanded to see his manifest, and Callan handed it over without fear. They flipped through it, snorting at the boring items. One opened a crate, tore open a food brick, chewed it, and spat on the ground. Rotten taste, he grumbled, and shoved the lid back on. Neither noticed the faint hum that pulsed inside, hidden within the pack. Neither knew that if this box sat long enough in their storage hold, the disruptor inside would leak subtle signals into their systems, making their machines falter. To them, it was just tasteless food, and to Callan, it was the perfect disguise. The officers ordered several crates for their fleet, paying half and threatening to take the rest by force if he refused. Callan bowed slightly and agreed to deliver. The shipman himself kept his face humble, the face of a man afraid of power. Inside, he smiled coldly. Not long after, officers from the rival fleet, the Carthus Dominion, came with their own demands. Their armor was dark blue, their weapons sharp and heavy, their eyes burning with hatred for the Valens. They too needed supplies, and they too treated Callan like dirt. They threatened, they shouted, they offered promises of protection if he served only them. Callan listened, nodding politely. He pretended to agree, pretending he cared only about staying alive and making money, promised them crates of circuits and water purifiers, the very ones that carried his hidden gifts. The Carthus checked nothing. To them, a human trader was nothing but a tool. They thought he feared them, thought he was loyal to whoever stood tallest in the room. They did not understand that every trade, every box, every deal was another step in his hidden plan. As the station lights dimmed, into night cycles, Callan sat alone in his ship's cabin. He thought of the irony of it all. Both great empires believed they controlled him. Both thought they could bribe or threaten him. But in truth, they were already carrying his devices back to their fleets, planting the seeds of their own weakness. He did not feel guilt. The galaxy had burned long before he chose this path. Soldiers had destroyed colonies, killed innocents, and treated traitors like tools. If their pride and cruelty blinded them, then he would use it against them. He was only giving them what they demanded, only selling them what they begged for. And hidden inside that trade was his trick, the secret no scanner could find. Still, he moved carefully. One mistake, one curious soldier opening the wrong panel, and everything would end. He lived on the edge of danger, and every day could be his last. But danger was nothing new to a tradesman who had crossed pirate routes, bribed corrupt officials, and cheated smugglers who thought themselves clever. Compared to that, dealing with arrogant soldiers was almost easy. He had learned to smile at threats, to bow at insults, to look weaker than he was. That mask was his weapon. His true face was sharp, cunning, filled with fire. And he knew one day, when the fleets finally tore each other apart, his mask would fall, and the galaxy would see what one merchant's trick could do. For now, he rested, letting the engines hum quietly under his feet. Outside, massive warships prepared for battle once more, their commanders thinking only of pride and glory. They did not see the shadow that had slipped between them, carrying nothing but simple crates. They did not see how much power a tradesman could hide in plain sight. Callan closed his eyes and whispered to himself, "They will never know until it is too late." The next cycle began with alarms across the station. Both the Valen and Karthus fleets had pulled back after a heavy clash, and both had suffered great losses. Now their surviving ships were hungry, desperate, and bleeding fuel. Callan could see the fear in the faces of soldiers as they hurried through the halls, shouting orders and demanding faster supply. For them, the war was endless, and each day felt like a blade pressed against their throats. But for Callan, it was an opportunity. He walked through the crowded market hall with his trade ledger in hand, calm and quiet while chaos burned around. He knew that desperation always made men careless. It would pay anything, promise anything, and overlook everything if it meant survival. That was when a merchant's tongue could be sharper than a commander's sword. A Valen officer cornered him first. The reptilian alien's armor was scarred, and his scales were dark with burns. He seized Callan by the shoulder and hissed, demanding more supplies immediately. Their fleet had been crippled, he said, their engines failing, their weapons draining, faster than expected. They needed power cells, water, and circuits at once. Callan lowered his eyes, nodding as if in fear, though inside he was already calculating. He offered the officer crates at a price that was high, but not insulting. He promised delivery within the hour. The officer shoved a credit chit into his hand and barked a threat. If the supplies were not delivered as promised, Callan's body would be thrown into space. Callan bowed low, thanking him for the honor of serving the Empire. The officer sneered, believing he had frightened a weak human into obedience. He never noticed the cold light in Callan's eyes as he turned away. Not long after, a group of Karthus soldiers approached, their tusked leader slamming his fist onto Callan's small trade desk. They accused him of working with the Valens. He claimed they had seen his crates being loaded onto enemy ships. Callan listened quietly, letting them spit their accusations, then spoke softly with careful words. Explained that he was only a humble trader, that both sides forced him to serve, and that his loyalty was only to profit. He even offered to prove his honesty by giving them the best circuits and cleanest water at a fair rate. The Karthus leader glared, ready to strike, but Greed won over suspicion. They agreed to take his goods, demanding a large shipment for their fleet before nightfall. If he refused, they said, his ship would be torn apart piece by piece. Callan promised to deliver everything they needed. Once again, he bowed in humility, while secretly hiding the quiet satisfaction of a hunter setting a trap. The truth was that every deal he made was like playing with death itself. Each side believed they owned him. Each side believed they could kill him whenever they chose. He lived under constant threat, walking a path so thin it could break at any moment. But this was the life of a tradesman who dealt in more than goods. Callan was trading in survival, in secrets, in shadows. He marked each deal in his ledger, not only for credits, but for information. Soldiers were careless when they spoke in his presence. They did not see him as a threat, only a tool. And so they whispered about battle plans, weaknesses, and losses. Without fear, Callan heard it all. He heard which fleet was starving, which ship had failing engines, which commander was desperate enough to betray his own men. Every word was another weapon for him, though no one realized it. That night, as Callan loaded crates into his ship for delivery, his hands moved with precision. Each box that left his hold carried his hidden devices inside, humming softly, invisible. 2 scanners. He knew that once they reached the fleets, the seeds of collapse would spread. Engines would stall, weapons would flicker, and power would drain without explanation. Soldiers would blame each other. Commanders would accuse spies. But no one would ever think of the simple merchant who bowed and smiled. As he locked the cargo hold, he thought about the risk. If even one soldier grew suspicious and tore apart a crate piece by piece, they might discover the trick. If that happened, his life would end before he could even reach his chair. But Callan had learned long ago that the boldest trades were always the most dangerous. And this was a trade not of goods but of war itself. When he returned to his cabin, he stared at the star maps on his screen. The fleets were closing in on each other again, preparing for another clash. Their commanders thought only of glory, not realizing they carried poison in their own bellies. Callan whispered to himself that war was nothing more than business written in fire, and he was a businessman, one who had found the greatest bargain of all. He traded crates for credits, smiles for threats, and in return, he bought power without anyone knowing. Death walked beside him every moment, but he treated it like an old partner. A deal with death was still a deal, and Callan was a master of deals. Outside, the station buzzed with tension as fleets prepared to launch once more. Soldiers armed themselves, commanders gave speeches, and engines roared in the docking bays. None of them saw the small human merchant leaning against his ship, watching quietly with eyes that saw deeper than theirs. They were giants in armor, wrapped in pride, and he was only a man in worn clothes. Yet he knew something they did not. When their weapons clashed again, it would not be strength that decided the battle. It would be the trick hidden in their own supplies, a trick they had willingly bought from him. And when the fighting began, Callan would be far away, drifting, silently in the shadows, waiting for the moment when giants fell. The fleets launched into the black once more, filling the void with engines that roared like thunder and weapons that gleamed with deadly light. The Valens came first, their crimson ships cutting across the stars in tight formation, hungry to finish what they had started. The Carthus followed, their dark vessels heavier and slower, but packed with brutal firepower. Both sides burned with rage, both ready to kill, both certain victory was near. Callan watched from the distance in his small cargo ship, screens glowing. Faintly, as he tracked their movement, his hands were steady, his face calm, but inside his chest, his heart beat like a drum, knew what was hidden inside those fleets. He had sold them the seeds of their own undoing, disguised in crates of food, circuits, and power packs. And now, for the first time, he would see if his trick truly worked. The first blasts of fire streaked across the void. Crimson light and blue energy slammed into shields, shaking warships until sparks burst from their holes. Both sides screamed into comms, barking orders, swearing vengeance. The battle raged as it always did, but then, slowly, something began to change. A Valen cruiser fired its main cannon once, twice, then suddenly went dark. Lights flickered and engines coughed out, leaving it drifting like a dead whale. The crew panicked, voices desperate over the comm channels, but no one understood what had happened. At the same time, a Carthus frigate tried to launch its torpedoes, yet the launch bays jammed. Doors sealed shut, alarms blared, and nothing moved. The commander shouted in fury, thinking his engineers had failed him. But the engineers swore the systems were fine. They were lying, but they didn't know it. The crates they had loaded carried more than food. One by one, the ships began to stumble. Shields failed on a battleship for no reason at all. power drained from another's engines as if life itself had been sucked away. Weapons overheated without firing, circuits burned out, like paper in flame. Commanders screamed for answers, their fleets collapsing piece by piece, but their crews were helpless. Callan leaned forward in his chair, eyes shining as he watched. The trick was working. The tiny devices hidden in his goods had activated, feeding their poison into every system they touched. Invisible, silent, impossible to trace, they spread. Chaos faster than fire through dry wood. Both sides were struck, both sides crippled, and neither knew the cause. They accused each other of sabotage, shouting intercoms, blaming spies and traitors. But no one looked at the simple merchant ship drifting far behind, its engines cold, its lights dimmed like a ghost. The chaos grew wild. Ships fired blindly, hitting allies as often as enemies. A Valen destroyer rammed into one of its own cruisers, both ships shattering in a storm of fire. A Karthus battleship tried to retreat, but its engines refused to answer, leaving it stranded and helpless as enemy cannons tore it apart. Soldiers screamed, some crying for orders, others calling for mercy. Commanders barked until their throats cracked, but no orders could fix machines that no longer obeyed. War had turned to madness, and Callan sat in silence, the calm eye of the storm. He had never fired a shot, never lifted a weapon, yet he was watching fleets crumble because of him. He felt no guilt. The soldiers had brought this fate upon themselves when they demanded his goods, when they treated him as nothing, when they filled their ships with his hidden tricks. They had bought their death, and he had simply delivered it. Hours passed, and what had begun as another great clash of empires ended in scattered wrecks and fading signals. The mighty fleets, once proud and filled with fire, were broken into drifting pieces of metal. Survivors fled in escape pods, voices crying across the channels, begging for rescue that would never come. Callan's ship glided through the wreckage, like a shadow, silent and slow. Saw bodies frozen in the void, weapons floating useless, cargo spilling from torn hulls. He reached out a hand, brushing his fingers against the cold console, and whispered to himself that this was the true power of trade. Not the guns, not the fleets, but the quiet trick no one ever saw coming. He moved carefully among the ruins, collecting what he needed, fuel tanks still half full, crates of rations drifting loose, precious metals torn from broken holes. The war had ended here, but for him it was only business. He loaded his holds calmly, moving with the patience of a man who knew no one was watching. The fleets were gone, the soldiers scattered, and he was the only one left to claim the spoils. As he worked, he thought about the irony. Both empires had believed they owned him, had threatened him with death if he betrayed them. Yet in the end, it was they who had bought betrayal with their own hands. He had not betrayed anyone. He had only kept his word. He had given them exactly what they paid for, supplies. That those supplies carried death was simply part of the trade. When his cargo holds were full, Callan sat once more in his chair, watching the broken battlefield drift. Silently in the dark, he felt no triumph, only a cold satisfaction. This was not the end. There would be more fleets, more battles, more desperate soldiers begging for supplies. He would be there, quiet and humble, ready to sell them what they needed. And always, hidden in the goods, would be his trick. They would never learn until it was too late. He leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment, listening to the hum of his ship. To the galaxy, he was still only a merchant. But tonight, he had ended a war. Without firing a shot, and no one would ever know. The battlefield was no longer alive with fire. What had been a storm of weapons and rage only hours before was now nothing but drifting wrecks. Silent and broken against the endless black, Callan's ship moved slowly through the graveyard of giants, his old scanners picking up faint signals of life, but no organized fleets. The mighty empires that had sworn to crush each other had collapsed in confusion. Betrayed not by spies or traitors, but by their own greed. They had swallowed his goods eagerly, and in doing so, they had swallowed their defeat. As Callan guided his vessel between twisted hulls, He thought about how quickly pride could turn to silence. The soldiers had believed themselves unbreakable. Their commanders had spoken of glory, conquest, and victory. Yet now their fleets floated like corpses in the dark, engines dead, weapons cold, voices fading into static. He had seen many battles before, but none ended so suddenly. It felt as if the universe itself had held its breath and then exhaled, leaving only dust. Escape pods drifted among the wrecks, carrying survivors who shouted weakly into open combs, begging for rescue. Alan listened, their voices filling his. Ship-like whispers from ghosts. Some cursed their enemies, swearing revenge. Others cried for lost comrades, sobbing quietly as the cold pressed in. A few begged for mercy, promising anything to whoever would save them. Callan kept his combs silent. He did not answer. He was not their rescuer, not their savior. He was only a tradesman, and the trade was already complete. They had bought from him what they needed, and in return, they had been given exactly what he promised, supplies that carried the seed of ruin. That was the bargain, whether they had understood it or not. He would not break silence to comfort them. He was only here for what the dead had left behind. His ship latched onto drifting containers, pulling them in with mechanical arms. He collected fuel cells that still had charge, food crates that had not spilled, and metals that could be sold for high value. The battlefield was rich with treasure, and no one remained strong enough to stop him. Once he had been a small trader, ignored by soldiers and mocked by other merchants. Now he drifted among the ruins of empires, taking wealth as easily as if he were scooping coins from an open chest. Yet his expression was not joyful. His face remained calm, even stern. He knew that this victory was not the end, but only the beginning. If the Valens and Carthus could fall so easily, other powers would learn. Whispers would spread. Stories would grow. And stories were more dangerous than weapons, for they traveled faster and reached ears Callan never wanted to hear. Already, the neutral station that had once been full of shouting soldiers now stood quiet and uncertain. Merchants whispered to each other about the strange collapse of both fleets. Some swore that sabotage had been planted. Others claimed the machines themselves had rebelled. None suspected the quiet human who walked through the halls with a steady step, buying tools and selling scraps. To them, he was still nothing. To them, he was still just a face among hundreds. But Callan knew the truth, that if anyone looked too closely, if anyone traced the crates back to his ship, the mask would break. That was why he worked quickly, finishing trades in silence and avoiding attention. His life depended on invisibility, and invisibility was a fragile cloak once suspicion began to rise. Still, as he returned to his ship and looked once more at the graveyard of fleets, he felt a cold kind of pride. He had seen something few ever understood, that great wars did not collapse because of the largest cannons or the bravest captains. They collapsed because of hunger, thirst, and empty engines. Soldiers thought of battles as fire and fury, but merchants knew battles were numbers. And supplies? He had only proven what he always knew, that a tradesman's trick could be sharper than any blade. The giants had fallen not because he was stronger, but because he had known where to strike. And he had struck in the place they never thought. To guard their stomachs. Days passed, and no fleets returned. Patrols that arrived later found only ruins and confusion. Neither side admitted the truth of what had happened. Both empires spread lies to their citizens, claiming victory or retreat. But their silence betrayed them. The sector that once burned with endless war was quiet now, abandoned, like an old battlefield no one wished to speak of. And still, Callan's small ship moved in the shadows, carrying wealth gathered from corpses and secrets carried in silence. He had played his role well. No one had seen him. No one had known. The collapse of giants had been written in blood and fire, but the hand that guided it had been invisible. That was how Callan preferred it. That was how he would survive. Yet, even as he prepared to leave the sector, a thought lingered in his mind. He had ended one war, but the galaxy was wide, and war was never finished. Other empires would fight, other fleets would clash, and soldiers would again demand supplies. When that time came, merchants would be called. and when merchants were called, so too would come the quiet chance to shape battles without firing a single weapon. Callan did not know if he would ever dare to use his trick again, but he knew one thing. The galaxy had learned nothing. They would keep fighting. They would keep buying. And when they did, he would be waiting, patient as ever. With his simple crates and his deadly secret, the war had reached a point where no one believed in easy victories anymore. The invaders had already lost more than they had planned, and the humans were no longer fighting as soldiers, but as hunters, calculating every move with deadly precision. kYeah, the merchant who had started as nothing more than a clever trader, had now become the voice of strategy. His tricks and plans had turned the battlefield into something far more dangerous than the invaders ever expected. But in this final part of the story, his greatest trick was yet to unfold, and it would decide everything. The invaders gathered their largest fleet, thinking they would crush humanity once and for all. The sky above Earth was filled with their ships, glowing like a false dawn. But kYeah was calm. He had prepared for this day. For weeks he had been trading false routes, wrong data, and secret messages into the enemy's networks. They had planted seeds of doubt among their commanders, whispering through captured signals that one of their own factions was betraying them. The invaders, already shaken by so many defeats, began to argue within themselves. Some thought their own leaders had sold them out. Some thought the humans had gained allies among the stars. Division spread like fire through dry grass. At the same time, the humans revealed something the enemy had never imagined. Hidden in the asteroid belts were ships disguised as mining vessels. For years they had been ordinary tools of commerce, slow and unimportant. But inside, kYeah had filled them with weapons, traps, and the ability to strike from shadows. When the invaders moved toward Earth with their mighty fleet, these traders came alive, attacking from behind, cutting supply lines and collapsing routes of escape. The enemy thought they were surrounded by a second army. In truth, it was only a handful of clever tricks, but the timing was perfect. The first explosions were mistaken as accidents. Then panic began to spread. Their generals shouted for order, but the signals they used to command were jammed. Every channel was filled with kYeah's false voices, copies of their own leaders giving contradictory orders. Some ships fired on each other, believing betrayal had begun. Others fled without permission. Humanity's real warships struck only at the weakest points, never exposing themselves to full risk. They fought like shadows, striking and vanishing, while the disguised merchant ships tore apart the enemy's confidence on Earth. Civilians watched the sky, seeing distant flashes as if new stars were being born. They did not know the details of the battle, but they felt something change. For the first time, they believed the war could truly be won. Fear gave way to hope, and across the planet, people began to cheer. The invaders tried to regroup, but every move was predicted. kYeah's years as a trader had taught him how to read the flow of goods, the paths of ships, and the habits of captains. War, he realized, was not so different from trade. It was about knowing where the other side would move and making sure they paid a price for every mistake. Now he turned that knowledge into a weapon sharper than any blade. At last, the great flagship of the invaders tried to retreat. Its commander broadcasted a final message, cursing humanity, vowing revenge. But as the massive ship fled toward the dark side of the system, it found a trap already waiting. kYeah had sent miners months earlier to set charges into the orbit of a dead moon. With a single signal, the explosives shattered the rocks, creating a storm of debris. The flagship entered the field and was torn apart, its glowing wreckage marking the end of the invasion. Silence followed. The sky cleared. The enemy, leaderless and broken, surrendered or scattered into the dark. Humanity had survived. The strongest weapons, not with the largest fleet, but with the cleverness of a merchant who knew the value of every risk and every reward. When the dust settled, the people called kYeah a hero, but he only smiled. "I am still a tradesman," he said. "I only gave them a bad bargain." His words spread across the planet, a reminder that strength was not only in steel and fire, but but also in wit and patience. The war was over, and humanity had won its place among the stars. The invaders had learned a lesson they would never forget, that even on a death world, a simple trick could topple an empire. And so, the legend of the tradesman's trick lived on, whispered in markets, sung in halls, and remembered by every captain who set sail into the unknown.